Good morning, everybody. I'm so happy to see you all here and feeling very grateful for your company. I'm here to host the Sunday talk. I'm Kyoku and I live and work here at Hokyoji. I'm happy to first find, can I find Stephyn Butcher? There you are. Okay, hold on a second. So I want to introduce Jushin Stephyn Butcher, who's giving our talk this morning. He started his Buddhist journey in 1997 and eventually made his way to becoming a student of Dokai's, who ordained him in 2013 and he received jukai in 2013 and was ordained in 2017. He's also our treasurer, and he is also the person that posts photos and interesting news on our social media. And I'm sure he would say, please like our posts. Please share them with your friends, because that's a major way in which we make new friends. Well, this is interesting. Anyway, I'm getting Zoom feedback, so that's what's going on. So let me just keep going and saying he's planning to give the talk this morning, and its title is Zen Master Epictetus. And I think that's all I need to say. Take it away, Jushin.
All right. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. And I guess the right way to say would be thank you for the opportunity to volunteer to give the Dharma talk this morning. So the title of my talk this morning is Zen Master Epictetus. So instead of a lot of bad Japanese and Chinese, this morning we get to hear a lot of bad Latin and Greek. So it'll be something different. And the title is only slightly tongue-in-cheek. Epictetus knew nothing of Zen Buddhism. He was separated by some 5,000 miles from Bodhidharma, hanging out in Shaolin Monastery, itself an obstacle, but also he's separated by about 400 years. Bodhidharma is about 400 years later. And yet Epictetus and the other Stoics were broadly interested in the same kinds of questions that Indian philosophers, Buddhist philosophers, the Jains, the Brahmins, that they were interested in, which is, what is the good life and how do you live it? And I think the Stoics' answers to some of these questions are interesting. They're interesting to us as part of our sort of our own cultural heritage, although I'm quick to remind people that there is sort of this is the ancient world, it's not East and West. The world was very different back then. It's many ways, it's very similar and also sometimes different to Buddhism. And I'm not the first to notice this. There are actually several books on the topic. Just to give you a bit of a flavor, Nassim Taleb called Stoicism Buddhism with an attitude. Stoicism is sort of experiencing a resurgence these days. There was a previous one in the Renaissance. So I think it's worth knowing a bit about Stoicism, and I think they have some interesting ideas that are worth knowing and not just knowing, practicing. So the founder of Stoicism was Zeno of Citium. He was a wealthy merchant who lost everything in a shipwreck. And this is kind of a common theme, like the Stoics are always, losing things. So, especially as we get to the later Roman Stoics, they're constantly being banished because they don't like the emperors, and banishment and exile were sort of the step ahead of being put to death or being asked to commit suicide. And most of the time in banishment, you lost all your personal possessions. You were sent off to some island, or you were told to stay 400 miles away from Rome. And you lost them. So he was rescued by pirates, which is topical because today is International Talk Like a Pirate Day. So he was rescued by pirates. He was taken to Athens, and he was meandering around town. We went into a bookshop, which is also, I just love this idea that somebody in 300 BC is wandering around town and wanders into a bookshop. He was leafing through the books, and he found one that he liked, that he thought was particularly good. It was about Socrates. And he goes to the bookkeeper and he says, where can I find me one of these philosopher guys? And the bookkeeper says, well, there goes one right now. There's Kratos of Thebes. And so Zeno chased after him, became his student. And in time, he started his own philosophical school. And they were originally called, predictably enough, the Zenonians, which does not roll off the tongue. So I'm thankful they changed their names to the Stoics. It's after the Stoa. There was a painted porch in Athens in the marketplace, the Agora. And unlike the other schools of the time, which we'll mention them, but we won't talk about them. But the Cynics, the Skeptics, the Epicureans, they all met in private, but the Stoics met in public. They met on the porch in the marketplace. Stoicism later spread to Rome and the Roman Empire. It became popular with the upper classes because it was very practical and sort of action oriented. There are sort of modern criticisms of Stoicism as being elitist, and I don't think they're necessarily fair. Stoicism was eventually eclipsed by Christianity, but the Christian intellectuals, especially like St. Augustine, that borrowed heavily from the Stoics, especially the ideas of virtue, are borrowed from the Stoics. So a few famous Stoic philosophers. In a lot of cases, the writings survived of us a lot of times in the same way to the writings of the Zen masters, right? They survive as quotes. One of them wrote like 705 books, but we only know from somebody else the names of the books as titles. Like that's how we know he wrote 7 and 5, because somebody remembered all the titles. Things are funny when you get to actually get to Epictetus. He had a student who took notes. And so that's why we know anything about actually what Epictetus directly taught. So a lot of things didn't survive. So Zeno is about 334 BC. He was a merchant, became a philosopher. He lived to 72. Cato the Younger, we'll also hear from, 95 BC. Seneca the Younger is 4 BC. Epictetus is 50 AD. And Marcus Aurelius, probably one of the most famous of the Stoics. He was Roman emperor. He was one of the so-called 5 good emperors. How many emperors, you might ask, were there? That only 5 of them were good? There were 85 emperors of Rome, and they came up with 5 good emperors. Marcus Aurelius was one of those. He is actually sort of he was the philosopher king. So it's a lineage that spans about 6 centuries. And sometimes reading, so a lot of things survive as quotes. So it's just, there's a lot of really nice sound bites on different themes. And it sometimes feels like reading the Dhammapada, because a lot of things are very short. So ancient Greek philosophy is not like philosophy today. And in fact, it has much more in common with Indian philosophy, with the Jains and the Brahmins and the Buddhists of basically the same time, in that it is a system of thought with regard to action. And it basically has 3 parts. Physics, so how does the world work? logic, how do we think correctly about it, and ethics, which is sort of what's the right thing to do, what's the good life. And if you squint, you can sort of see the Tripitaka in there, because it's sort of like Dharma, Abhidharma, and Vinaya. It seems to have been maybe a common theme in ancient thought. So what is this doctrine? How does the world work for Stoics? And this is something very familiar to Buddhists. It's a world of cause and effect, of causes and conditions. I think what's probably slightly different is that it is ordered, it has patterns and laws, and these laws are discoverable. It's animated by logos, active reason. Chrysippus says the universe itself is God and the universal outpouring of its soul. It is the same world's guiding principle, operating in mind and reason, together with the common nature of things and the totality that embraces all existence. So, quoting Einstein, this is Spinoza's God. Einstein says, I believe in a God who reveals himself in the lawful harmony of the world, and not in a God who concerns himself with the fate and the doings of mankind. So it's an interconnected world. And again, this is not stuff that would be foreign to Buddhists. Marcus Aurelius says, we'll get to practices of the Stoics later, but reflective practices, contemplative practices are a big part of the Stoics, which is thinking about things. So Marcus Aurelius asks us to constantly regard the universe as one living being, having one substance and one soul, and observe how all things have reference to one perception, the perception of this one living being, and how all things act with one movement, and how all things are cooperating causes of all things that exist. Observe too the continuous spinning of the thread and the structure of the web, which I really like because it reminds me, of course, of Indra's net, but it's dynamic. It's a web that's constantly being built and spun from thread. And so this is the Stoic principle of sympathia. For logic, I'm going to grossly simplify and say that the main focus of Stoic logic is reason, and it is because we are of the same nature of the universe that we can understand the universe. So the universe is reasonable, and so we can understand it through reason. And this is what Chrysippus was saying, sort of, it is the same world's guiding principle operating in mind and reason. So God is the universe, and this outpouring, and we're a part of it, and we have that. So it's actually funny though, because they end up with Buddha nature problems. So if everyone has Buddha nature, why do you need to practice? So they end up with the same thing. Like if the universe is reason, why are people unreasonable? So they end up with the same. And so that brings us to ethics. And so I think ethics is really sort of the meat here for us. And I want to distinguish, and this happens a lot with things that enter common usage. This is not Stoicism with a small s, where we think of somebody as indifferent and passionless and emotionless. Also, like Epicureanism with a small e, we think of somebody as being a glutton. Actually, the Epicureans were much more interested in avoiding pain than they actually felt that chasing after pleasures was defeating the purpose. So these things get sort of over the several thousand years, these things have gotten a little mixed up. So we're talking about Stoicism with a capital S. But having said that, this is the funny part. The Stoics seek to eliminate passion. But this is the great part for us. What did passion mean in ancient Greek? It meant suffering. Pathos was suffering. So the Stoics sought to eliminate suffering. Putting it, so it's to eliminate suffering. More precisely, it's not to react passively or instinctively to life's events, what we might call our habitual tendencies. And that was sort of the thing we'll get to later, I'll mention it now. But part of Stoics meditated, and part of the meditation was sort of the watching thoughts and not having judgments about them, and then practicing letting impressions and judgments go to then actually deal with the current situation using reason. So for the Stoics, the highest good is virtue. And actually, this is what St. Augustine gloms onto and brings into Christianity. But for the Stoics, there were 4 virtues. There were wisdom, justice, temperance, and courage. For the Stoics, wisdom is both knowledge and experience. It is a practical, lived philosophy. And again, this is true of all the ancient Greek philosophies. Like, it's not just something you sit in your armchair. Zeno encouraged, this is actually, I think, where the saying comes from. Zeno encouraged the Stoic to listen more than they spoke, because you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Epictetus encouraged beginner's mind. He actually said, you cannot learn that which you think you already know. Temperance follows the golden mean. This actually comes, I think, from Plato, which is neither deficiency nor excess. He has a great metaphor about this. Remember to conduct yourself. This is Epictetus talking. Remember to conduct yourself in life as if at a banquet. As something being passed around comes to you, reach out your hand and take a moderate helping. Does it pass by you? Don't stop it. It hasn't come yet. Don't burn in desire for it, but wait until it arrives in front of you. And then he goes on, and I think this is kind of where Stoicism gets its bad name. Act this way with your children, spouse, towards position, towards wealth, because one day it'll make you worthy of a banquet with the gods. So I think this is where the small s comes from. Epictetus is not talking about this. In fact, Epictetus is in old age, adopts a child and that would have otherwise died, and raises it with a lady friend. They don't think that there's no record of them being married. So it isn't a completely detached. It's closer to it's the Buddhist non-attachment. And for Stoics, especially of the 4 positive, or what we normally think of positive, the 8 worldly concerns in Buddhism, fame, wealth, health, possessions, they generally fell under categories they called things indifferent. So if you get them, that's good, because they support the good life and pursuing the good life. But if you don't get them, then don't worry about them. Don't worry about it. And justice is the social good. So they're very concerned with the social good. Like all such ancient peoples, they were blinded by the times, but they were at least trying to move in that direction. Sympathia leads the Stoic towards full engagement with the affairs of the world, to do what is virtuous. Sort of, if not me, who? In fact, it's the Stoics who embedded the term cosmopolitan, pala meaning citizen, cosmos of the world. Marcus Aurelius said, what's bad for the hive is bad for the bee. So they were socially engaged. And then courage is the the will to act and to maintain integrity. And there's a lot of nuances to integrity, which we'll get to, I hope, in a minute. But integrity was incredibly important to the Stoics. It is, in fact, in general, suicide is considered bad because it's an abnegation of social responsibility. But there were cases where suicide was considered to be justified. All right, so that's where the overview. Stoic philosophy is something you do, and so there were Stoic practices, and this included training in logic, training in Socratic dialogue and self-talking. So if anyone is familiar with Dr. Ellis, Dr. Brown's like cognitive behavioral therapy, so you do all the self-talking. This is where it comes from. They actually talk about how they were inspired for that from the Stoics. Memento Mori, which we'll get to in a minute, mindfulness meditation, and then I think the interesting one, the thing I find, Memento Mori, because they have different glosses on it. So Memento Mori is remember death. That's definitely something that resonates with Buddhism, but I think the journaling daily reflection is something that's, I think, kind of interesting and then unique to Stoicism. So I mentioned earlier, the mindfulness meditation part of this is not particularly new to us. They weren't, it wasn't sort of the open awareness type of meditation. It was a meditation with an object, but it was like with your thoughts, probably closer to shamatha. They were particularly interested in training to avoid gut reflexes, acting on impressions. They wanted you to sort of, they didn't want no jumping to conclusions, and that sort of required training. Marcus Aurelius writes, today I escaped anxiety, or no, I discarded it because it was within me, in my own perceptions, not outside. The Stoics were really big on basically guided meditations and reflection. And one of the big focuses of that reflection was really kind of life's ups and downs. And there's sort of three related concepts here. One is the dichotomy of control. The other is amor fati, which is the love of fate. And then the last is memento mori, which is remember death. And I think for me, this is the big thing I find. We find this, right? This is in the 12 steps. It's in the serenity prayer. Lord, grant me the power, let's say the power to do the things I can, the patience to accept things I can't, the wisdom to know the difference. So the dichotomy of control, this comes from Epictetus, asks, is it up to me or not? If it is not within my control, there's no sense of getting upset about it. Marcus Aurelius says, basically, is the melon bitter? Toss it out. Are there brambles? Go around. Like, if you can take care of it, they're very big on not complaining. So they're constantly admonishing them to not complain, like not to gossip, not to complain. Like, if you can do something about it, do it. If you can't do anything about it, then bear it. Of course, they're also big on the other side, where Marcus Aurelius says things along the lines of, you've endured this before. You've endured things like this before. You can endure this again. So so the astonishing thing, really, when you start to think about it, is how very little is within your control. I remember, and this is a very long time ago, and this is sort of, in Buddhism, the conception of karma has changed over the many, many centuries, where I think in the beginning, karma was entirely just intentional action. I think certainly in the later schools, at least in Tibetan Buddhism, karma becomes just associated with causes and conditions in general. If not, maybe the causes and conditions you experience. His Holiness Penor Rinpoche used to say something like, yeah, about 97% isn't in our control. It's due to karma. And I remember sitting there and going like, A, that's awfully precise. And B, that can't possibly be true. Like 97% we only have like 3% wiggle room. And I think as I've gotten older, I begin to think he was very generous, that we have 3% wiggle room. Maybe if you practice a lot, you get 3% wiggle room, but many of us might be towards fractions of 1%. So they recognized that very, very little was in our control. Certainly not your body. You can't control whether you're sweating or not, and just sort of in the outside world. And so, Epictetus says, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. And the more we value things outside our control, the less control we have. So there's lots of elements of impermanence in this, and we'll find that more as we get closer to Memento Mori. Marcus Aurelius says, there is never a need to get worked up about things beyond your control. And this sort of moves us into, this is actually Nietzsche. Nietzsche, he didn't like the Stoics because his philosophy was not one of order, it was one of chaos, like the world is just chaos. But there were certain aspects that he respected, and one was sort of this, what is and isn't in your control, and he called it amor fati, the love of fate. And again, this is where in writing this talk, you're sort of like, the Stoics just say it so well, but at the same time, you're like, I can't just be quoting everybody. So Epictetus again says, don't hope that events will turn out the way you want. Welcome events in whichever way they happen. This is the path to peace. And so you hear echoes here of at least one particular translation of Faith in Mind by the third patriarch. The great way is not difficult for those without preferences. Right, so you just welcome events. I think Seneca said something along the lines is, nothing happens to the wise contrary to their expectations. Nothing happens to the wise contrary to their expectations. So there's two senses of that. One is they're open to what's happening. And the second is there's actually a practice where you imagine bad things happening. So as you imagine, it's like, what if I lose my sight? What if I lose my job? What if I lose all this? Then, in this sort of bucket of guided meditations, premeditating the worst sort of makes you appreciate what you have, but also prepares you should that actually happen. For Marcus Aurelius, he says, you don't have to turn this into something. It doesn't have to upset you. And so there's a story that the Stoics tell that I think is cool because it actually mirrors the sutra, the Salata Sutra, the Arrow Sutra. And it's kind of, it literally comes at it from a different direction. It's from the archer's point of view. So the basic idea is, you can train in archery all your life, and you should train, if you're going to be an archer, train to be a good archer. You can buy the best bow and arrow, you can take care of them, you can do everything right. But once you release the arrow, it is out of your control. The wind, the rain, the target can move, you can call a doctor. It's all out of your control at that point. So they sort of teach, it's not, again, a pessimism. I know as Buddhists, we're sort of used to people saying that we're pessimistic. And so we kind of have to remember, the Stoics get the same claim against them. So it's not that you shouldn't do anything. In fact, you should do your best, but you shouldn't attach to the results because they are largely out of your control. And so the thing that was mostly out of our control, the biggest thing out of our control that the Buddhists recognized and the Stoics recognized was death. And so they had the idea of memento mori, which is remember death. There's actually was a thing in Rome, it was beyond the Stoics, where when one of the generals won a battle and was paraded through Rome, there was a slave put on the chariot with him. And as he was going through the cheering crowds, it was the job of the slave to whisper in his ear, "You are but a man. Look behind you. Death comes." So that while he was getting all these accolades, he wouldn't get supposedly wasn't supposed to get a big head as well. So again, so the first aspect of this Memento Mori I want to cover is very common to us as Buddhists. You could leave life right now, let that determine what you do, say, and think. That was Marcus Aurelius. Epictetus said, keep death and exile before your eyes each day, along with everything else that seems terrible. By so doing, you will never have a base thought, nor will you have excessive desire. But this came more of a general contemplation. Epictetus said, with regard to whatever objects give you delight, are useful, or are deeply loved, remember to tell yourself that what general nature they are, beginning from the most insignificant things. If, for example, you're fond of a specific ceramic cup, remind yourself that it's only ceramic cups in general of which you are fond. And then if it breaks, you will not be disturbed. And then he talks about expanding this to other things. For Seneca, it's a spur to action, but there becomes sort of interesting things here. He says, let us prepare our minds as if we'd come to the very end of life. Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's books each day. So he's turning this from sort of a general, life is fleeting impermanence to saying, do this every day, reflect every day on what you did well, what you didn't do, and that time is short. And at its extreme, he turns this into a practice where he says, count each day as a separate life. Imagine the basic idea is, imagine that you could die in your sleep, and this is part of something Marcus Aurelius is in the Stoics. You could die in your sleep. You wake up each morning and you go, wow, I didn't die in my sleep. Here's a new day. And so it's a new life. It's kind of like a video game. It's like you get a new life every day. And it's Marcus Aurelius who says this. Marcus Aurelius takes it even further and just says, think of yourself as already being dead, that you've lived your life, it's done, you died. Now take what's left and live it properly. What doesn't transmit light creates its own darkness. And this sort of leads, there's a huge amount here, to gratitude. When you arise in the morning, think of what a privilege it is to be alive, to think, to enjoy, to love. It's Marcus Aurelius. Epictetus. No, this was actually Epicurus. Epicurus. So the funny thing is, I think it's Epictetus, but it might have been before him, he says this funny thing is that I learn from the other schools. It's not above me to take good sayings. I go there not as a traitor, but as a spy. So he's going into the other schools and he's going, well, hey, this is a good idea. It's mine. I'm taking it. So do not spoil what you have by desiring what you don't have. Remember that what you now have was once among the things you hoped for. And then something that I think is easily could have been said by a Buddhist. True happiness is to enjoy the present without anxious dependence upon the future, nor to amuse ourselves with either hopes or fears, but to rest satisfied with what we have, which is sufficient for he that is so wants nothing. The greatest blessing of mankind, our blessings are within us, within our reach. A wise man is content with his lot, whatever it may be, without wishing for what he has not. And that sort of leads me now to basically the most famous practice of the Stoics, which was journaling. So everything we know about Marcus Aurelius is because his meditations, which are actually just a bunch of journal entries, survive. And some of them are not very good. So this should give us some I guess encouragement if we've ever tried journaling ourselves, to sort of get down and clarify our thoughts. There's a big tradition of this in the West. I sort of wish some of the old Zen masters had kept journals. It would be fun if they had survived to sort of actually see their thoughts continued on. to see, what they thought about their practice. I don't know if we want to read what they thought about their students. Maybe we could redact those. But the interesting thing is when we read Meditations, this is Marcus Aurelius writing to himself to encourage himself. Like he had no idea that these would be published. And so here's my favorite one. And it reminds me of this because Hartman brought this up the other day. It was last Thursday at Morning Zazen when he said something along the lines, couldn't stay on the covers all day or had to get up or something like that. So this is Marcus Aurelius talking to himself. At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I have to go to work. As a human being, what do I have to complain of? If I'm going to do what I was born for, the things I was brought into the world to do, am I not going to do the things I was brought into the world to do? Or is this what I was created for? To huddle under the blankets and stay warm. So this is the Emperor of Rome, and he doesn't want to get out of bed. And he's like, no, this isn't what it means to be a human being. And so I'm gonna get out. I'm gonna get out. So I was gonna leave with a couple quotes. I was gonna leave with one like, I don't know. So there's one sort of like typical, like, so this is Marcus Aurelius. These are both Marcus Aurelius again. Get busy with life's purpose, toss aside empty hopes, get active in your own rescue. Yeah, sure. But I think this is a better one. Pass through this brief patch of time in harmony with nature and come to your final resting place gracefully, just as a ripened olive might drop, praising the earth that nourished it and grateful to the tree that gave it growth. That is the Reader's Digest condensed version of a very small bit of the Stoics. And it's not, I only went a little over. Questions? Yes, Hartman.
Very interesting talk. Thanks, Jushin. I first heard about the Greek and Buddhist connection, and Stephen Batchelor has written on this. And there was a philosopher, and I can't remember his name, who went to India. Pyrrho of Elis, that's right.
Yeah.
So he was there within about a century of the Buddha, I believe, according to the latest, birth date of the Buddha, and he actually may have run into people who actually saw the Buddha in person. Anyway, so he brought some of that Eastern stuff. He did meet with guys. And so it's very interesting for you to go into this a little deeper than I have. But there is also a website called How to Be a Stoic. I don't know. Are you familiar with that?
It's all very popular right now, which is sort of how it came into my orbit.
Yeah, this philosopher, Massimo Pigliucci.
Yeah.
He's a philosopher of science and an ex-biologist and stuff. And he has this whole website, and I've seen interviews with him. It's pretty interesting stuff. So thanks for taking a dive into it.
Pyrrho traveled with Alexander the Great as far as India. And there is some dispute as to whether or not he actually talked to. So they don't know who he talked. He met some sadhus. Could have been Buddhists or Jains. The latest research I saw, so there's some dispute. It's like how can you learn anything? Like you just met some sadhus along the road. Apparently, Alexander the Great had 3 translators with him, but it turns out he was probably there for 18 months. And so there's a better chance that he probably was able to to learn what they taught and bring it back. He actually was a founder. I think he's the founder of the, or at least one of the strands for the skeptics. And why Stephen Batchelor likes him is because the main, I guess, tenet there is also in opposition to the idea that the universe is made of harmonious laws, is that we can't know anything. So it fits very well into like the Koan tradition. Stephen Batchelor practiced in Korean Zen, and they have what is this? What is this? Is the single koan in that practice, and so that's essentially the practice of the skeptics. It's like, no, you can't fundamentally know anything. Of course, you always run into problems with that, right? So if you can't fundamentally know anything, how can you fundamentally know that? Like we always end up in what I call the Buddha nature problem. But yeah, it's interesting, and it's interesting because for myself, I really like the sort of the elaborations on Memento Mori, because it's certainly in the early Buddhists. There were the meditations like meditate on yourself or your partner as being like dead and a corpse and pus and everything, and yes, that's true. And then you have in the Tibetan tradition you have chud, which is where you imagine yourself being chopped up and carved and giving an offering to demons and hungry ghosts and stuff like that. And this one is more of a sort of like, imagine you've already died. Like you're afraid of death. Imagine you already died. Like now you're free. Do what you're supposed to do. Which is hard. I kind of like the game over thing. Like every day you wake up, it's a new game. And it's like, oh, bonus life. So, any other questions?
Or comments?
Comments, questions? Yes, Dokai.
Yeah, you brought back a memory that I don't think I've thought of since it happened. I was a freshman in college taking my the very first semester or quarter, whatever it was. And it was like a history of Western civilization or something like that, like your very first history course. And we started out Mesopotamia, but I don't remember much, but I think I do remember the professor talking about Seneca and the Stoics. And he really, and I don't remember clearly, but it was something he said, what do you think about this idea about desire? It was something about desire, I think. Is if you had no desire for something, would you feel any difficulty or pain, if you just had no desire for things to be different? I think it was something like that. And he didn't just say it, he made us think about it, for like 5 minutes or so. He kept drilling us. So what do you think about that? But it was from the Stoics. And I remember that was the first time I ever had that kind of a revelation. I'd never thought about that. So I haven't thought about it since until now. So, and at least it's quite a vague memory, but it was a poignant one that made some kind of difference when I contemplated it in my life. And I don't know if it had any carryover and why I'm doing what I'm doing right now, but if I think back, I do remember it as being a special moment when we were talking about that. So anyway, I just thought I'd share that.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for your talk.
Oh, sure. I mean, I think we get this so we get this a lot. I think we get this in this charge also in Buddhism and in the Stoics of being quietistic. This idea that we should just accept everything the way it is. And that's not what they're saying. You have to accept what's happening now the way it is. It's too late. The causes and conditions have ripened. And it's, Marcus Aurelius said, doing nothing can also be an injustice. But they're basically really big on saying, but don't go flying off the handle. Try and figure out what the best thing is to do. And then also, you may not succeed. And you basically do your best. Most of the Stoics, for the period of time they lived in, was just, and first of all, there's literally a survivorship bias here, in that the middle and lower classes are not writing anything that's going to survive to the current day. So we don't know how widespread Stoicism might have been. So you get this impression that it's elitist, but that's because the only people who wrote anything down that survived was playwrights. Seneca was a playwright. But like Marcus Aurelius, you cannot help but, when you get to that period of time, you cannot help but reflect on current events, with the Senate rubber stamping the emperor, with the emperor, so their big things were exile and banishment. Didn't always mean that you lost anything, but you did lose your position, and you often your wife, your family, everyone stayed in Rome, and you were banished. Sometimes you were just completely exiled and you lost everything, and sometimes your family had to go with you. And then, because they wanted, so this was in lieu of capital punishment. The other one that was in lieu of capital punishment is they would send a guard to watch you commit suicide. And this happened, I think, to Cato at least, and others. But others were, we think of it as a brutal time. Some of the Stoics were like, they were they were very pro women's rights, and that a marriage should be a marriage of equals. And this is in the very, very early ADs, and some of the writing is very modern, feels very modern. But I mean, it's hard for people to overcome their circumstances completely. Any other comments, questions? All right.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Jushin. That will give us something to chew on. I want to thank you for bringing that forth. And I also want to make a few announcements. We have yet another Sunday talk coming up next Sunday, which will be given by Reverend Susan Akio. And she's going to surprise us with the topic. I also wanted to mention that you'll be shortly receiving more information about a men's retreat that will be led by Rice Mark Anderson and Bob Ziglovich, who are two very long-time Zen practitioners and explorers and spreaders of it in places like public schools and corporations. So we're hoping that people will be interested in being part of that. So let's see, what else do I need to say here? Beside, go out on Facebook and like us. I just want to say that we, of course, are completely supported by all of you and all the others who choose to donate effort and support. So please consider making a donation. In the chat box, you will find a link that will take you to how you can donate. And you will also find the chants that we will end our morning with. So here we go. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. I look forward to seeing you all next time around. May your week go well.